Hello everyone, I'm Jemilah from the Sunway Center for Planetary Health, and with me today we have the great honor and pleasure to be with a very dear friend, Eric Berglof, who is the Chief Economist at the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. So we're going to have a quick informal chat with Eric. So welcome Eric.
Thank you.
To our center. Now I am so excited because finally a big multilateral bank like yours has recognized the importance of planetary health. And AIB has been among the most forward-leaning multilateral banks in recognizing the shifts that are required, that infrastructure is not just an economic and investment, but also a public health intervention, right? So maybe we'll just have a little bit of a chat today. You're in Malaysia today. We just missed the first tropical cyclone storm that would have hit Malaysia last night. But it was downgraded, so thank God for that. So I just wanted to ask you, Eric, infrastructure as a determinant of planetary health. That was the crux of the report, the flagship report this year. And AIB now frames infrastructure as central to human and planetary well-being. So what catalyzed this shift, and how does it reshape your investment logic?
Well, I joined the bank in the middle of COVID, and before COVID we had done nothing on health. Then suddenly in COVID we ended up doing everything on health, more or less. Very large vaccine contracts, large contracts for PPE protection and so on. So all those things made us reflect on what, as an infrastructure bank, how can we help deal with some of these challenges that we are facing. And so we created a social infrastructure department, we created a health department, or health part of that social infrastructure department. But there was still this sense that how does it really connect to what we do? We can do things in the health sector, but what was really, can we use what we do in energy, what we do in transport, what we do in water, what we do on digital infrastructure to affect human health outcomes? And that seemed to us to be a much greater challenge and potential impact. And then finally, we have been talking about nature as infrastructure.
Yeah.
So thinking about nature as the most important infrastructure for sustaining life on Earth, and of course ultimately all economic activity as well. So what can we do by investing in nature, and managing nature and making nature more resilient? That also helps human health outcomes. So that's really where it all comes together.
I'm really, first of all, congratulations. I'm amazed because that is classic planetary health, because COVID was a zoonotic leak, and that is because of the destabilization of our land and forests. So I think, that being able to connect the dots so quickly, I think is great. Now, in Asia, there's always this push for growth, and then there's also a push for rapid emissions reduction. And this seems to be at opposing ends to each other, right? So how does AIB manage these trade-offs while safeguarding health and equity?
Yeah, first of all, I think we should really talk about sustainable growth. So it's about, if we have a lot of growth now, but then create conditions where we cannot sustain growth over time. I think that is, certainly one aspect that we want to make sure that when we invest infrastructure investments are so important because they lock us in for decades, sometimes even centuries. And so what we do today is absolutely essential. But also when we talk of how we measure growth, we measure growth in GDP and so on, but we need to think much more how we just not build economic capital, but we also take care of nature capital. And finding that balance, I think, is exactly what we are trying to do.
And I think on nature positive and also blue-green infrastructure, it's not just green. I know that AIB invests a lot in looking at water. You yourself are directly involved. And on mangroves, wetlands, watersheds, they deliver immense protective value, right? But why are these still underfinanced in relation to others, and how can AIB unlock the scale for that?
Yeah, I think first of all, because we don't properly value all these ecosystem services that these wetlands or these forests or these rivers produce, all those, whether we talk about the carbon capture of forests and wetlands, when we talk about air purification, water purification, cross-pollination, recreation, all those things that we do benefit from, but we don't assign proper values to. And I think that's the first thing we need to start doing. And we can do that relatively straightforwardly when we deal with governments, and because government can decide that we're not just going to do a traditional, what we call cost-benefit analysis. We're going to look at the traditional cost-benefit, but extend it to include natural capital. And the government, whether a local authority or central authority, can decide we're going to do this, and they'll do it. And I'll give you one example. We were working with a local authority in Inner Mongolia in China, and they wanted to do restore part of the wetland for flood management. They had problems with floods, and so they came to us with this idea, and we were very happy to consider it. But then we said, let's apply this natural capital valuation, and then suddenly we could look at all those benefits that this wetland provided. And when we sort of gave back to them this analysis, they said, and maybe we should look at the whole wetland. So there it went from what I would call a nature-based solution for a specific challenge, floods, to thinking about this as a landscape that produced all these ecosystem services. Again, governments can do that. The real challenge is to how do you get the private sector to get into these kind of investments? And there one has to think about, many things that have to do with, government providing some framework policies that allows businesses to both know will be the outcomes if you invest in that particular wetland, for example, but also maybe providing things like biodiversity credits that allows them to get some credit for helping these ecosystem services. And then a government can help to maybe de-risk or provide guarantees or insurance. So all these instruments, combining them, I think is the way forward.
And I think that, in today's world where we have heat and floods and air pollution and disease outbreaks already reshaping our macroeconomic landscape, I think this whole systems thinking approach is very critical, which is very much in line with planetary health. And I shared with you earlier that Malaysia just launched a National Planetary Health Action Plan. I think as a plan it's very, very good. But of course, the proof of the pudding is in the implementation, right? But how does AIB take this kind of systems approach and also the interlinkages that I mentioned between disease and pollution and disasters into incorporating them into risk models? Is this something you do?
I would say that we are in the beginning of journey. We should have said early on that we are still a young institution, just 10 years old, and maybe the advantage of being young is that we still have a lot to shape around the organization and build into the DNA this type of thinking, and that's, I think, is our advantage. Of course, the World Bank and AIB have done a lot in this space, but we have the advantage of building on what they have done and integrating it into what we are doing. So all these risk assessments, we obviously have to do it for our own investment, but also the more we can do, of course, to help governments think through how do you assess this kind of risk. So for many, both the value of this asset, but also the risk. So if we use these natural capital valuation models, both at the national level, but also at the individual companies and so on, developing countries and emerging economies have tremendous assets that have a big economic value. It's just that we don't take them into account today. If we took them into account, we could start, getting maybe a lower cost of capital for these countries. We could maybe help them reduce some of their debt problems by doing net for nature swaps and so on. And so, but the other side of that, of course, now the world is developing in a direction where all these natural assets are being challenged by climate change, by environmental pollution and so on. Then there's a risk for these countries too. So for us, given that we work in this country, we can be part of reducing these risks and also making policymakers aware of these risks. I think that's a big responsibility.
And I think actually it turns out to be a blessing to be young, because I think you have maybe the flexibility to be a bit more adaptable and also learning from other people's mistakes. I think multilateral development banks have been ingrained in a certain debt model, and as you rightly say, that we have not been able to calculate the value of natural assets that developing countries have. And I think that was a really good point you made, and how do you reduce debt and so forth.
I mean, I can give you another example, which is these flying rivers. This moisture that is projected out from forests, particularly tropical rainforests, they project it up into the atmosphere. This water, obviously we are used to paying for water, but it actually, the great majority of this water comes from Brazil, about 40%, and then the Congo Basin, Indonesia, maybe 2/3 or even 3/4 of the water in these flying rivers, and it spreads all over the world, come from these countries. So if you started pricing that, like we are used to paying for water, so why couldn't we? It's a bit more complicated with other dimensions of nature, but the water part should be very straightforward.
Because people assume water is a natural asset in their own place, where actually water comes from other places as well, and we don't calculate it. And I think that's where you think about equity and inclusion, right? The value and the contribution of the developing world to the developed world as well.
And of these communities that maintain these natural assets.
Especially, I think we were in Belém together, and we saw how indigenous people really called this out very strongly. And you were in Belém to launch quite an important report. Maybe you can mention a little bit about it.
No. So it's, as I said, it is quite straightforward. I think if we can get governments to think like that, for them to take this into account. And how do you get the private capital into these investments? So we presented a report that, working with the Paulson Institute and all of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the African Development Bank. And the idea was to see if we have these tremendous opportunities, and governments are aware, but how to get the private sector. So we looked at what we call public-private partnerships for nature. And you can think of this at the sort of higher, maybe conceptual level, that there's always a policy needed for companies, if for no other reason, just to create certainty around what it means to invest in nature. But often you need some extra incentive, encouragement to do it. But then, and this is what I think the great advantage of thinking about nature's infrastructure, that we have a lot of experience from investing in and financing investments in infrastructure. We can take this to nature. So and it's very standard in infrastructure to think about some kind of collaboration between the public and the private. We have public-private partnerships as one extreme, but we have a lot of things in between, and finding the right balance between the public and the private. And we can take these forms of contracts that we use in regular public-private partnerships, and we can apply them to nature. Instead of saying, build, manage and transfer, for example, you can talk about restore and manage and transfer. And so and you can do that for basically everything that you build. You can just say, let's use restore instead. And so that was the message that we tried to convey in Belém.
Now, everywhere I go now, every conference, everyone's talking AI and technology, right? It's almost as though that's the panacea, like that's the magic bullet that's going to solve all problems. I have my own views. I feel that, yes, I think AI and technology will drive a lot of innovation and change, efficiency and so forth. But I also see the dark side of it, which is, the need for high use of energy and cooling, which requires a lot of water, which we are facing a water scarce world today. But from early warning systems to AI-enabled cooling, what does AIB see the biggest leapfrogging potential of AI and the risks as well? How do you view the risks?
Yes, I think that we are still at the very early stages of understanding AI, and also, even I would argue, also understanding maybe the full implications for resource use. Maybe there are more efficient ways from energy point of view or from water point of view than the way we do it today. But I think that there's tremendous potential for better understanding, better measuring, what we are doing, the impact we're having on nature and human health through AI. So we should use that potential, but we have to be aware, as you say, about when we build these data centers, what type of power we use and how do we cool it. And these are very real issues, I think, for a country like Malaysia, which is water stressed. This can be very, because we have to admit we are involved in data centers here, and we are focusing very much on the energy that we want to have, green, renewable energy into these. But the water dimension is very important. And
Absolutely.
We want to highlight now in this report that we're working on right now that we must keep the water focus.
I really hope and count on you to do that, because I think we take this very lightly. We have a lot of rain, but in terms of water stress, we are a water stress country.
This is what I look at. So India is the largest country population, and India has about 18% of the world's population, but only 4% of the water. But most of that is the monsoon that they cannot keep. And more on top of that, it also transfers a lot of chemicals and toxins into the Indian Ocean, so the Indian Ocean is being affected, and the more the monsoon is destabilized or amplified, the more water you get, the more pollution you get in the ocean, and you get this very unfortunate circle.
Maybe the last question that I have for you is around, again, coming back to planetary health and health. One of the, I would say, the weakest links in many of the things we do around sustainability, whether it's ESG measurements or others, is around health co-benefits and health indicators. I think we are not good generally at measuring health co-benefits and dollarizing, if you like, those co-benefits. What is AIB going to do about this, and how do we move forward together on this?
Well, I'm a little reluctant to use co-benefit, because I think these are benefits in that, and that we should think of this in a holistic way. So it's not we're doing something and then we get some co-benefits on the side. We really should integrate it and look at it in a coherent way. But I think the challenge here is when you look at any infrastructure, whether it's a road or a metro or solar park, you should really take into account the human health impact. And you can't expect every investment officer or every energy expert to fully understand that. So you need to reduce it to tools that, once you do a road, you look at, you have a checklist of things that you need to look at, and you need some kind of maybe metric to translate. If you build this road in a particular way, what is the impact on road safety? What is the impact on nature from this road? How could you build it differently? And always having some kind of measure, so what you're dealing with. But the point is that you cannot expect everyone to be an expert on planetary health.
Absolutely.
When they make this investment.
Absolutely. I think that, why I think for simplification we use the word health co-benefits, because most of the time people don't even think that it affects their health. I think we have to do a better job at the narrative. Tell people that actually everything that happens, whether it's infrastructure, economic development, societal issues, all have links to health and all aspects of health and well-being as well.
But what I also a little bit would like to use the co-benefit is that it often starts with human health, whether we like it or not. When we feel our own health is affected, or when our children's health are affected, that's what provokes action. That's what provoked action in China, the whole environmental program, what became then the climate action, and now the nature, all that came out of air pollution. And when I look at countries in South Asia or all over Asia, it is air pollution, heat. These are the things that really drive change. And so talk about it as co-benefits feels that you are reducing it. This is, I think we should really think of this as central, and we should not just care about human, but also, of course, all other living things we should take into account and just say, this is planetary health. It's about all
things on Earth. I work on air pollution a bit, and I think that, unlike water pollution, which is very visible, air pollution is sometimes visible, but most of the time people ignore. And I think China has shown us the way in terms of, you live now in a Beijing that has blue skies, where it's silent because you don't hear the cars and so forth, right? What would it take? What advice would you give someone like me who's trying to drive change in air pollution? Where do we start?
I mean, first of all, I think what really triggered, and we may not talk so much about it, was the fact that American embassy in Beijing started publishing the air pollution level. So the one thing is you have to put this data out there for people to have some. And now today, everyone living in Beijing looks at their app for the
Air
health,
quality.
air quality every day. So, I don't know that this is a very precise number, but people say that maybe residents of Beijing lost 10 years of life expectancy from air pollution and have now gained back 4 years. So we still have some way to go in Beijing, but I think it's going in the right direction. This year has also been better than last year and so on. So every when people feel that there is this progress, I think that helps a lot to sustain the effort, and these things people need to have some reassurance over time also that you are actually improving things.
So in fact, data, impact on health, and making that narrative strong, almost like a public right to understand the data and the impact on health as well. Of course, I remember it was the Beijing Olympics. They were so very badly affected, and also a little bit of face saving, right, to make sure that you actually improve.
And then the measures were quite harsh. You needed to send very strong signals that we care about this, and there was signal to those who were responsible for pollution, but also the people who were affected. That you see that as policymakers you actually take their concerns for real.
We both came back from Belém, I'm sure like me, with a lot of mixed feelings. Right? We made some progress in some areas, health, in terms of adaptation, finance. I think there was some language on that. But we didn't make much progress on fossil fuels and defossilization. I think what the world needs is to understand the tipping points, both negative and positive. And I think you have been very aware of the global tipping points. So next year we are organizing the Global Tipping Points Conference in Malaysia. So we look forward to work with you, because I think finance and health are important tipping points. I think it's not enough now to talk just about climate, temperatures. I think people need to see how in reality it affects them. And I think one area as well we need to strengthen is behavior change. And that is very much linked to communications, the arts, faith, spirituality, all these things. So I want to look forward to welcoming you with us next year for the Global Tipping Points Conference.
And then take it that you will discuss both negative tipping points
and
positive
tipping points. And I think this is where we need your help, because I think China has been really one of the remarkable countries that have shown us how positive tipping points can happen. And in the latest Global Tipping Points report, as you can see, energy, heat exchangers and so forth, this commitment to renewables is something that is very much a positive tipping point. So with that, just to say thank you, Eric, for spending time with us. And I know we communicate often, but I really hope to see more of you here.
Yes, and I hope to spend more time here, and I'm very impressed by what you're doing here in terms of the Planetary Health Center, but also I think the whole context of Sunway University is very impressive for me, and very encouraging to see how much you can do in a context like this.
Thank you, and thank you for making time for this interview.